The glow of the laptop screen cast a cold, blue light across Gustav's face, standing in stark contrast to the warm, rhythmic breathing of his wife, Lucasta, asleep in their bed. Outside, the gentle rain of Toulouse washed over the terracotta roofs, a peaceful European night that masked the devastation unfolding in Gustav's study. It was just a misdirected email, a late-night synchronization error from Lucasta's cloud drive. But the attachment wasn't a grocery list or a physicist's mundane thermal calculation. It was a photo of Lucasta, tangled in the sheets of a hotel room, and beside it, a forwarded PDF of the classified QA inspection report. The very report Catriel, the lead quality assurance specialist, was supposed to destroy. The report that detailed the fatal microscopic fracture in Gustav's engine turbine. In one click, Gustav realized his brilliant wife hadn't just given her body to another man. She had given him the loaded gun that could end Gustav's life's work. If stories of silent betrayals, high-stakes revenge, and the devastating cost of secrets speak to you, stay with me. Let's uncover how a man dismantles the woman who broke him, piece by piece. The rain in Toulouse did not fall. It hovered, a fine, chilling mist that clung to the terracotta roofs and wept down the grand windows of the suburban villa. Inside, the house was a sanctuary of modernist architecture, all glass, steel, and muted tones, a perfect reflection of the two scientific minds that inhabited it. Gustav sat in the heavy leather chair of his home office, the room submerged in darkness save for the harsh, unyielding glow of a MacBook screen. It was 3:17 a.m. Upstairs, the faint, rhythmic sound of Lucasta's breathing echoed through the baby monitor they had repurposed years ago as an intercom, a ghost of the family they had never quite gotten around to starting. She was sleeping peacefully, her brilliant mind resting, her conscience apparently clear. Gustav's finger hovered over the trackpad. His pulse, normally as steady as the metronome of a precision clock, thudded painfully against his ribs. He had only opened her laptop to locate a shared calendar file, a mundane task for a husband organizing their upcoming trip to the Paris Air Show. Instead, a cloud drive synchronization error had forced a hidden folder onto the desktop. The folder was labeled with a simple, innocuous string of numbers, 0412. April 12th, the day of the final structural integrity test for his life's work, the Helios 9 turbine. The first file he clicked was an image. It took a fraction of a second to load, but that fraction stretched into an eternity. It was a photograph taken in the dim, golden light of a hotel room, the grand balcony, if the distinct wallpaper was any indication. Lucasta's bare shoulder was visible, her dark hair tangled against a white pillow. And beside her, partially obscured but unmistakable in his smug repose, was Catriel. Catriel, the lead quality assurance specialist at Aerospatiale Dynamics. The man whose signature could greenlight a billion-euro project or kill it in the crib. The man who had smiled at Gustav across the boardroom table just 10 hours ago, praising the aerodynamics of the new chassis. A cold, agonizing numbness spread through Gustav's chest. The betrayal of the flesh was a sharp, jagged knife, twisting in his gut. Lucasta, his wife of 8 years, the brilliant physicist who understood the complex thermodynamics of his heart better than anyone, was sleeping with a man who dealt in red tape and bureaucracy. But as Gustav's trembling hand clicked the next file, the knife of infidelity was replaced by the guillotine of professional ruin. It was a scanned PDF. The header read, "Confidential, internal audit only." It was the true, undoctored QA inspection report from April 12th. The one that detailed the microscopic, fatal stress fracture in the Helios 9's titanium housing. It was a flaw Gustav had discovered too late, a mathematical oversight he had confessed only to Lucasta in a moment of desperate vulnerability. They were supposed to fix it quietly, rewrite the algorithms, and bury the error before the official review. Instead, Lucasta had given it to Catriel. Gustav stared at the screen, the blue light reflecting in his wide, unblinking eyes. He read the attached email thread, his breath turning shallow. Catriel wasn't just holding onto the report, he was cataloging it. "Keep him busy, my love," Catriel had written to Lacasta 2 weeks ago. Once I have the final CAD files, I'll take care of the board. We'll have our leverage. Leverage. It wasn't just an affair. It was a hostile takeover of his life. Catriel had the power to not only take his wife, but to strip him of his patents, his reputation, and potentially face criminal negligence charges if the board believed Gustav had actively tried to hide a fatal flaw. Upstairs, the floorboards creaked. Lacasta was turning over in her sleep. A lesser man would have stormed up the stairs. A lesser man would have shattered the laptop, screamed until his throat bled, and demanded answers. But Gustav was an aeronautical engineer. He spent his life managing pressure, understanding breaking points, and calculating the exact moment a structure would fail. He slowly closed the folder. He dragged the synchronization icon back to its hidden directory, wiping the recent activity from the system cache. He closed the laptop screen, letting the darkness of the study swallow him whole. He would not confront her. Not yet. If Catriel wanted to play a game of variables and leverage, he had chosen the wrong opponent. Gustav leaned back in his chair, listening to the rain tap against the glass, a terrifying, silent calm washing over him. The blueprints of his marriage were broken, but the blueprints for his revenge were just beginning to form. The espresso machine hummed, a low, mechanical vibration that resonated with the dull ache behind Gustav's eyes. Sunlight pierced the floor-to-ceiling windows of their kitchen, illuminating the floating dust motes and casting long, sharp shadows across the marble island. Lacasta stood by the counter, her slender fingers elegantly adjusting the collar of her silk blouse. She was a vision of European intellectual grace, her dark hair pulled back into a severe but striking chignon. "You were up late," she remarked, her voice a smooth, familiar melody that now sounded entirely foreign to his ears. She did not look at him, her attention seemingly fixed on pouring the steamed milk. "Just reviewing the thermal threshold algorithms," Gustav replied. He marveled at the steadiness of his own voice. It was a perfectly calibrated lie, delivered with the casual exhaustion of a dedicated engineer. He watched as she set the porcelain cup before him. He noticed the way her phone rested face down on the marble, a detail he had previously dismissed as a quirk, now glaringly obvious as a defensive measure. "You work too hard, Gustav," Lacasta murmured, leaning in to press a fleeting kiss to his temple. The scent of her perfume, a sophisticated blend of bergamot and cedar, washed over him. He closed his eyes, remembering the image of her tangled in the hotel sheets. The scent belonged to a stranger now. "The board knows the Helios 9 is brilliant. You don't need to kill yourself over a fraction of a percent in efficiency." "It is not the efficiency they will kill me for," he thought, taking a slow sip of the scalding coffee. "It is the fracture you gave to Catriel." "Perfection requires sacrifice," he said simply, meeting her gaze. For a fraction of a second, he thought he saw a flicker of hesitation in her dark eyes, a microscopic stress fracture in her perfect facade. But it vanished, replaced by a warm, supportive smile. An hour later, Gustav walked through the sterile, echoing corridors of aerospatial dynamics. The facility was a cathedral of modern science, a sprawling complex of brushed steel and reinforced glass, where human error was systematically engineered out of existence. Yet, as he approached Sector 4, the Quality Assurance Division, the irony tasted like ash in his mouth. Catriel was holding court near a holographic schematic of the turbine housing. He was a handsome man, sharply dressed in a tailored navy suit that stood out against the sea of white lab coats. He possessed an easy, charismatic charm, the kind that engineers often lacked and administrators adored. "Ah, the man of the hour," Catriel called out, spotting Gustav. He extended a hand, his smile bright and predatory. Gustav looked at the outstretched hand. This was the hand that had caressed his wife. This was the hand that held the encrypted PDF capable of dismantling Gustav's life. He extended his own, gripping Catriel's firmly. "Catriel, how are the preliminary diagnostics holding up?" "Flawless, mostly," Catriel replied, his tone conversational, but his eyes locking onto Gustav's with a chilling intensity. "Though, you know my department, Gustav. We always dig deeper." We are required to look for the invisible vulnerabilities, the things others might want to gloss over. The threat was veiled, wrapped in the bureaucratic language of their profession, but it was deafeningly loud. Catriel was testing him, gauging if the brilliant engineer had any inkling of the noose tightening around his neck. "I encourage thoroughness," Gustav said, his expression completely blank, an impenetrable wall of professional detachment. "A system is only as strong as its weakest component. If you find a flaw, I expect you to expose it." Catriel's smile widened slightly, a shark sensing blood in the water. "Oh, I always do, Gustav. Rest assured." As Catriel turned back to his team, Gustav stood perfectly still amid the hum of the servers and the chatter of technicians. He was a man standing inside a burning building, calculating the structural integrity of the collapsing beams before making his move. Catriel thought he was the architect of this destruction, but Gustav was already drawing the blueprints for the ashes. The Helios 9 prototype dominated the center of Test Bay Alpha, a monolithic cylinder of polished titanium and carbon composite. It was a marvel of modern engineering, yet as Gustav ran his gloved hand along its frigid exterior, the metal felt like a tombstone. The sterile hum of the ventilation system faded, replaced by the ghost of a different sound, the crackle of a cheap vinyl record and the soft, breathless laughter of a woman. 7 years ago, there was no aerospatial dynamics. There was only a cramped, drafty apartment in Lyon, smelling perpetually of burnt solder and stale baguettes. In his memory, the room was bathed in the amber glow of a single desk lamp. Lucasta was there, her dark hair pinned up haphazardly with a drafting pencil, a smudge of graphite darkening her left cheekbone. She was bent over a sprawling schematic, her eyes wide with the raw, unrefined brilliance that had first drawn him to her. "The thermodynamics won't hold at Mach 3, Gustav," the memory Lucasta had murmured, tapping the paper. She had looked up at him, her gaze burning with an intensity that rivaled the propulsion systems they were designing. "But if we restructure the cooling matrix here, look." She had guided his hand across the blueprint, her fingers warm and calloused from the guitar she used to play. In that cramped room, they were not just engineers. They were gods shaping a new world from raw mathematics. They had collapsed onto the narrow mattress by dawn, exhausted, intertwined, and completely unified. Gustav blinked, and the amber light of Lyon shattered, replaced by the harsh, fluorescent glare of the Toulouse testing bay. The distance between them had not happened overnight. It was a slow, glacial drift. As the Helios project grew from a tabletop model to a €1 billion government contract, the apartment was traded for the glass villa. The shared drafting table was replaced by separate offices, different departments, and conflicting schedules. Gustav had buried himself in the relentless pursuit of perfection, building walls of titanium and proprietary data around his mind. He had thought Lucasta was safely inside those walls with him. He had never noticed the temperature dropping until Catriel arrived to light a fire in the freezing corridors of their marriage. Gustav stepped back from the turbine, his jaw tightening as another memory surfaced, brutal and recent. 3 months ago, the rain had been lashing against the villa's windows, much like the night he discovered the laptop folder. He had been sitting on the floor of his study, surrounded by printouts, his chest heaving with a silent, terrifying panic. He had found the flaw, a microscopic miscalculation in the housing stress tolerance that would only manifest under extreme atmospheric pressure. It was a career-ending oversight. Lucasta had found him there. She had knelt beside him in her silk robe, her hands gentle as she pulled his face to her chest. "We will fix it," she had whispered, her voice a soothing balm against his terror. "You and me, Gustav, like the old days in Lyon. We keep it off the books until the patch is ready. Trust me." He had trusted her. He had given her the foundational data, exposing his vulnerability to the one person he believed would protect it. Standing in the empty testing bay, Gustav felt a profound, chilling shift in his chest. The grief that had been threatening to drown him suddenly crystallized into something hard and sharp. Lucasta had not just taken a lover. She had weaponized his most intimate confession. She had taken the ghost of their Lyon apartment and handed it to a corporate parasite in a tailored suit. The woman who had guided his hand over the blueprints was dead. In her place was a stranger who traded his life's work for the thrill of a hotel room rendezvous. Gustav slowly peeled off his latex gloves, dropping them into a biohazard bin. He did not have the luxury of mourning a ghost. He had a machine to build and a trap to set. The boardroom of Aerospatiale Dynamics was an exercise in corporate intimidation. A massive slab of polished obsidian served as the table, reflecting the pale, severe faces of the 12 executives and military liaisons seated around it. The panoramic windows offered a sweeping view of the Toulouse skyline, obscured today by a relentless, drumming rain. Gustav sat at the head of the table, a perfectly tailored gray suit armor against the wolves. Across from him, the holographic projector hummed to life, casting a rotating, translucent blue model of the Helios 9 turbine into the air between them. Lucasta was seated 3 chairs down, her tablet pen tapping a silent, nervous rhythm against the glass screen. She wore a high-collared burgundy dress, a stark contrast to the sterile environment, her dark eyes fixed intently on the rotating engine. Gustav did not look at her. The thermal threshold tests have exceeded expectations by 4%, Gustav began, his voice a calm, authoritative baritone that commanded the room. He navigated the presentation with the practiced ease of a maestro, highlighting the aerodynamic efficiency, the revolutionary fuel consumption rates, and the projected launch timeline. The executives nodded, murmuring their approval. The golden boy of European aviation was delivering his masterpiece. Impressive figures, Dr. Visser. A sharp voice cut through the hum of approval. Catriel leaned forward, his elbows resting on the obsidian table, his fingers steepled thoughtfully. He was not a board member, merely an advisory presence from quality assurance. Yet he commanded attention with a casual, predatory grace. The lighting caught the subtle, expensive sheen of his navy suit. However, Catriel continued, his smile a thin, chilling line. We in QA are not paid to be impressed by theoretical models. We are paid to find the ghosts in the machine. The room quieted. Gustav's jaw tightened imperceptibly. He met Catriel's gaze, a flat, dead stare that betrayed none of the violent storm raging in his chest. I believe the diagnostic reports have been thoroughly vetted, Gustav replied smoothly. Is there a specific anomaly you wish to address, Mr. Laurent? Catriel's eyes drifted to Lucasta for a fraction of a second, a micro-expression of dominance that sent a spike of pure, undiluted rage straight to Gustav's core. Lucasta's pen stopped tapping. Not an anomaly, per se, Catriel said, his voice dropping an octave, slipping into a tone of quiet menace, but a concern regarding the structural integrity of the titanium housing under extreme atmospheric shear. The air in the room seemed to freeze. Several executives exchanged uneasy glances. We are running advanced stress simulations, Catriel continued, his gaze returning to Gustav, a triumphant glint in his eye. And while the data provided by your team is comprehensive, there are certain off-the-books variables that I believe require my department's direct oversight. To ensure complete transparency. It was a ransom note delivered in a crowded room. Catriel was not just hinting at the flaw. He was asserting control over the entire project. He was demanding a seat at the table where the patents were filed, effectively forcing Gustav to share his life's work, or face the devastating consequences of an unannounced audit that would uncover the fatal fracture. Gustav felt the familiar, crushing pressure building in his skull. If he argued, Catriel could demand a manual inspection of the prototype right then and there. The flaw was not yet patched. The engine would fail, the contract would be voided, and Gustav would be facing criminal negligence charges for hiding a catastrophic risk. He looked down the table at Lucasta. She was staring at her tablet, her knuckles white. She knew exactly what Catriel was doing. She was the one who had handed him the gun. Transparency is paramount, Gustav said, his voice remarkably steady. He slowly closed his presentation file. If quality assurance requires deeper integration into the final testing phase, I will personally ensure you have full access to our mainframes, Mr. Laurent. Catriel's smile widened into a smirk of pure victory. He thought he had won. He thought Gustav was surrendering the fortress out of fear. Excellent, Catriel said, leaning back in his chair. I look forward to our collaboration, Gustav. As the meeting adjourned and the executives filed out, Gustav remained seated, staring at the empty holographic projector. He had just handed Catriel the keys to his digital kingdom. But as Catriel walked away, arrogant and self-assured, Gustav allowed himself a small, chilling smile. Catriel had asked for full access to the mainframes. He was about to walk blindly into a digital labyrinth designed by a man who spent his life calculating how things break. The trap was set. The server room of Sector 7 was a subterranean vault of blinking LEDs and the deafening, continuous roar of industrial cooling units. It was a place where human presence was tolerated rather than welcomed, a cathedral of pure, unfeeling logic. For Gustav, it was a sanctuary. Down here, there were no wives with secrets, no charismatic rivals with extortion plots. There was only code, architecture, and the beautiful, brutal honesty of mathematics. At 2 a.m., the facility was deserted, save for the skeleton crew of security guards who rarely ventured into the deep freeze of the server banks. Gustav sat at a standalone terminal, his breath pluming faintly in the frigid air. The harsh white light of the monitor painted his face in sharp, exhausted angles. He had granted Catriel unrestricted access to the Helios 9 database, exactly as promised. It was the digital equivalent of leaving the front door wide open and the safe unlocked. But what Catriel didn't know was that Gustav was a master of false floors and hidden compartments. Gustav's fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, a rhythmic clatter that was swallowed by the ambient noise. He was not fixing the microscopic fracture in the titanium housing, not yet. Instead, he was building a ghost. He accessed the redundant safety protocols, the deep archive files that QA rarely bothered to check because they were considered immutable baseline data. With surgical precision, Gustav began to subtly alter the source code of the stress tolerance simulations. He didn't change the outcome. He changed the path the software took to get there. He introduced a microscopic latency, a tiny, virtually undetectable echo in the data transmission. Next, he created a mirror directory, a shadow folder buried deep within the labyrinth of the company's intranet. He named it with a string of alphanumeric characters that looked like a standard system cache. Inside, he deposited a heavily encrypted, corrupted version of the Helios 9 blueprints. They looked real. They carried the correct metadata. But any competitor who attempted to build an engine from them would find themselves with a multi-billion euro paperweight that would tear itself apart at Mach 2. The trap required bait, and Catriel's arrogance was the perfect lure. Gustav knew Catriel wasn't an engineer. He was an auditor, a man who understood the value of data but not its substance. Catriel believed he held the genuine, flawed blueprints, the leverage. He would inevitably try to download the final CAD files to solidify his control before the launch, perhaps even to sell them to a rival firm once he had ousted Gustav. Gustav's final act of digital sabotage was the tripwire. He wrote a custom security script, completely bypassed from the standard IT monitoring, and attached it directly to Catriel's new, elevated user credentials. The script had one simple function. If Catriel attempted to download the contents of the shadow folder, it would not block him. It would silently package the corrupted blueprints, stamp them with a covert, untraceable digital watermark, and simultaneously alert the Directorate General for Internal Security, the French Corporate Espionage Division. He stared at the screen, a bead of cold sweat tracing the line of his jaw despite the freezing temperature of the room. He was committing a felony. He was manufacturing a crime to frame a blackmailer. The irony was a bitter pill, dry and jagged in his throat. He had spent his entire life adhering to the strict, unforgiving laws of physics. Yet here he was, twisting the truth into a weapon of mass destruction. Execute, he whispered, his voice lost to the roar of the cooling fans. His finger depressed the enter key. The script compiled, vanished into the background architecture, and lay dormant. Gustav leaned back, rubbing his burning eyes. The pit was dug. It was deep, dark, and lined with corporate spikes. All he needed now was for Catriel to take a step forward, blinded by the illusion of power. And for that, he needed Lucasta to feel the pressure of the walls closing in. The dim, amber lighting of Café Lumière, a discreet bistro tucked into the winding streets of Old Toulouse, was usually a sanctuary for Lucasta. It was here, over glasses of robust Bordeaux and plates of duck confit, that Catriel had first unraveled the tightly wound physicist. Tonight, however, the atmosphere was suffocating. The air smelled cloyingly of truffle oil and stale perfume, and the low hum of conversation felt like a physical weight pressing against her chest. Lucasta sat across from Catriel, her untouched wine glass casting a distorted crimson shadow on the white tablecloth. She wore a sleek, charcoal turtleneck, an armor she often donned when she needed to feel impenetrable. Yet, she felt entirely exposed. Catriel swirled his wine, a slow, predatory movement that lacked the easy charm she had once found intoxicating. His eyes, usually warm and attentive, were sharp, calculating. He looked less like a lover and more like an auditor assessing a depreciating asset. Gustave was remarkably compliant in the boardroom yesterday, Catriel noted, taking a small sip, almost eagerly handing over the mainframe access. Tell me, Lucasta, is he normally this accommodating when his territory is threatened? Lucasta felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. The memory of Gustave's dead, impenetrable stare during the meeting flashed behind her eyes. He had been too calm, too perfect. Gustave is an engineer, Catriel, she replied, her voice tight. He calculates variables. If fighting you publicly risks exposing the structural flaw, he will yield. For now, Catriel repeated, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. But I don't want for now. I need the complete, finalized CAD files for the Helios 9 before the review board next week. Not just the stress tolerance reports. Everything. Lucasta's breath hitched. She stared at him, the romantic illusion shattering like cheap glass. The full blueprints? Catriel, what are you talking about? We agreed. You would use the flaw to force him to step down, to give you control of the patent filing. You promised me you wouldn't destroy him entirely. Catriel leaned across the small table, his face devoid of affection. The mask had finally dropped. We agreed to secure my position, Lucasta. And your husband is a stubborn, brilliant man. If I don't hold the entire architecture of his masterpiece, he will find a way to engineer himself out of this corner. I need the final files. He reached out, his fingers closing forcefully around her wrist. It wasn't a caress, it was a shackle. You have his secondary passwords. You know his encryption keys. You're going to get them for me. No. The words slipped out, sharp and breathless. Lucasta tried to pull her hand away, but his grip tightened painfully. She looked around the crowded bistro, suddenly aware of how trapped she was. Catriel, this is corporate espionage. If I get caught, no one is getting caught, my love, he whispered, his voice dripping with venomous sweetness. Because if I go down, the board finds out that the golden wife of Aerospatiale Dynamics leaked classified failure data to her lover in a hotel room. They find out you handed me the gun. The blood drained from Lucasta's face. The full weight of her actions crashed down upon her. She had betrayed Gustave because she felt invisible, because Catriel had made her feel seen. But Catriel hadn't been looking at her. He had been looking through her, straight at the Helios 9. She was not a lover. She was an access code. You used me, she breathed, the realization of physical blow. Catriel released her wrist, leaning back with a dismissive shrug. I utilized an available resource. Now, be a good wife and get me those files by Friday. Or I'll ensure Gustave learns exactly what kind of woman he married, right before I take his engine. Lucasta watched him signal for the check, her world tilting violently. She had traded a cold, brilliant husband for a smiling monster. And as she sat in the dim bistro, the terrifying realization dawned on her. She had to warn Gustave. But how could she warn the man she was destroying without destroying herself in the process? The pristine glass walls of Gustave's office at Aerospatiale Dynamics were a transparent cage. For years, they had showcased his relentless focus and quiet authority. Today, they displayed a man unraveling. It was 4 p.m., the fluorescent lights harsh and unforgiving against the scattered blueprints covering his mahogany desk. Gustav sat slumped in his chair, his tie discarded, his collar unbuttoned. He ran a hand through his hair, leaving it a chaotic mess that clashed violently with his usual meticulous grooming. He had spent the morning systematically introducing microscopic errors into a set of dummy calculations, a trail of breadcrumbs designed to look like the desperate flailing of a brilliant mind buckling under pressure. He was building the illusion of a panic-stricken engineer trying to patch a fatal flaw in the 11th hour. The door clicked open. Catriel stepped inside, his polished navy suit a stark contrast to the chaotic disarray of Gustav's sanctuary. Catriel closed the door softly, his smile wide, exuding the smug confidence of a victor surveying conquered territory. "Gustav," Catriel said, his voice dripping with faux concern. "You look terrible. Is the stress of the impending review board getting to you?" Gustav did not look up immediately. He stared blindly at a complex fluid dynamics equation, his breathing shallow and erratic. He was an actor stepping onto a stage, summoning every ounce of the genuine rage and betrayal he felt, and twisting it into pure, unadulterated fear. "The thermal threshold simulations," Gustav rasped, his voice a hoarse, defeated whisper. He finally met Catriel's gaze, letting his eyes widen with a perfect imitation of panic. "They're inconsistent. The titanium housing, it's failing under high shear stress in the secondary tests. The data you reviewed last week, it wasn't an anomaly. It's structural." Catriel's smile vanished, replaced by a sharp, predatory calculation. He moved closer, leaning over the desk, his hands resting on the scattered blueprints. "I told you, Gustav. I warned you about the ghosts in the machine." "I can't patch it," Gustav breathed, rubbing his face with trembling hands. "The algorithms are compounding. If the board demands a manual inspection before Friday, the Helios 9 is dead. The contract is void. I'll be ruined." He watched Catriel absorb the information. He saw the gleam of absolute power ignite in the auditor's eyes. Catriel believed he had broken the great Gustav Visser. "Ruined," Catriel echoed softly, tasting the word. He straightened up, adjusting his cuffs with leisurely precision. "That is unfortunate, Gustav. A catastrophic failure of oversight." "I need time," Gustav pleaded, his voice cracking perfectly. "Just give me until Monday. Keep your department off my back. Give me 48 hours to rewrite the cooling matrix." Catriel shook his head slowly, a mock sympathetic sigh escaping his lips. "I'm afraid that's not how QA operates, Gustav. My duty is to the board, to transparency." He paused, letting the silence stretch, heavy and suffocating. "However, if I am to put my own reputation on the line by delaying an audit, I require collateral." Gustav's heart hammered against his ribs, not from fear, but from the thrill of the hunt. The beast was taking the bait. "What kind of collateral?" "The final CAD files," Catriel demanded, his voice hardening, stripping away the remaining veneer of collegiality. "Full, unencrypted architecture of the Helios 9. I need to know exactly what I am protecting. I need the keys to the kingdom, Gustav. Transfer them to my secure terminal by tomorrow morning." Gustav stared at him, his expression a masterpiece of horrified resignation. He let his shoulders slump further, his entire body language projecting total surrender. "You're stealing it," he whispered hollowly. "You're taking my engine." "I am saving the project," Catriel corrected smoothly, turning toward the door. "And saving you from a negligence tribunal. Have the files on my desk by 8 a.m., Gustav, or I'll have the audit team in here by 9 o'clock." The door clicked shut. Gustav sat perfectly still for 10 seconds. Then, slowly, the facade crumbled. The trembling vanished. His breathing steadied. He sat up straight, his face an impenetrable mask of cold, calculating stone. Catriel wanted the CAD files. Catriel was about to download a multi-billion euro bomb, stamped with his own digital fingerprints. The trap was set, and the executioner had just tightened his own noose. The server room was as cold and unrelenting as Gustav's ambition, a subterranean vault that smelled faintly of ozone and static electricity. It was 3 a.m. In 5 hours, Catriel would walk into his office, open his secure terminal, and download the corrupted, watermarked CAD files, effectively sealing his fate as an industrial spy. The trap was flawless. But Gustav was an engineer. He did not build machines that ran on partial data. He had spent the last 2 hours meticulously scrubbing the mainframes to ensure no digital echo led back to his fabricated blueprints. It was a routine sweep, an obsessive attention to detail that had defined his career. However, as he navigated the hidden architecture of Lacasta's cloud drive, tracing the origin of the initial leak, he stumbled across an anomaly. It was a draft folder buried beneath layers of encrypted thermal reports. It contained a series of unsent emails and heavily redacted memos, all addressed to Catriel. Gustav frowned, the blue light of the monitor reflecting his sudden confusion. He opened the first document, his eyes scanning the dense text. It wasn't a love letter. It wasn't a conspiracy to steal. It was an argument, a desperate, mathematical plea. Catriel, you don't understand the stress tolerance. The draft read, dated 3 months ago, the night Gustav had first discovered the microscopic fracture in the Helios 9 housing. He's exhausted. The board is pushing for AQ3 launch, and the titanium won't hold under those atmospheric shears. I need you to run a shadow audit on the secondary cooling matrix. Delay the review process from your end. If you flag it as an anomaly, it gives him time to fix it without the board voiding the contract. Gustav stared at the screen, the silence of the server room deafening. The cold logic of his revenge suddenly hitched, the gears grinding against a contradictory variable. He opened another draft, dated a week later. Why are you copying the source files? I didn't give you the root access to build a case against him. I gave it to you to buy us time. You promised me an extension. If he finds out I shared the primary architecture, he'll never forgive me. A profound, sickening realization washed over Gustav. The betrayal was real. She had given his life's work to another man. She had slept with him in that hotel room. But the intent, the initial spark of treason, it hadn't been to destroy him. It had been a misguided, desperate attempt to protect him from his own impending failure. Lacasta hadn't handed Catriel a loaded gun to shoot her husband. She had handed him the blueprints of the gun to delay the execution. And Catriel, the charismatic auditor, had smiled, taken the blueprints, and built his own weapon of extortion. Gustav sank back into the cheap metal chair, a sharp, physical pain blooming in his chest. For weeks, he had fueled his meticulous, cold-blooded revenge with the absolute certainty that Lacasta and Catriel were partners in a hostile takeover. But Catriel was a parasite, manipulating a brilliant, exhausted woman who had cracked under the pressure of saving a man who had long stopped seeing her. The image of Lacasta in the hotel room flashed again, but the context had shifted entirely. It wasn't the triumphant culmination of a corporate heist. It was the tragic collapse of a lonely woman who thought she was bartering her loyalty for his salvation, only to realize she was being devoured. The cursor blinked steadily on the screen, a relentless pulse demanding action. Gustav's dilemma was a sudden, violent chasm. He had engineered a flawless trap that would obliterate Catriel's career and inevitably drag Lacasta through the mud of a corporate espionage scandal. He could still execute the plan. He could still watch them both burn. The data was irrefutable. The betrayal of the flesh was unforgivable. But as he stared at the unsent plea in the draft folder, a crack appeared in his frozen resolve. He realized, with a devastating clarity, that his brilliant, complex machine of vengeance was perfect, but the people inside it were fundamentally broken. And if he pulled the trigger tomorrow, the explosion wouldn't just destroy them. It would eradicate the last remaining truth of what they used to be. The annual Aerospatiale Dynamics Gala was a spectacle of wealth and ambition, held in the vaulted halls of the Site de l'Espace. Beneath the towering replica of an Ariane 5 rocket, the elite of European aviation mingled, their laughter mingling with the soft strains of a string quartet. The air smelled of expensive champagne, ambition, and the faint, metallic scent of impending disaster. Gustav stood near a display of early aerodynamic models, a glass of sparkling water held loosely in his hand. He was dressed in a classic black tuxedo, an immaculate shell that concealed the storm raging within. It was 9 p.m. In less than an hour, the security script he had planted would trigger, and the meticulously constructed world of Catriel Laurent would cease to exist. Across the room, Lucasta was speaking with a group of government liaisons. She wore a stunning backless gown of midnight blue silk, but the elegance of the dress only accentuated the rigid tension in her posture. She looked pale, her smile strained, her eyes darting constantly toward the entrance. She was a woman waiting for the executioner's axe. And then Catriel arrived. He moved through the crowd with the effortless grace of a shark navigating a familiar reef. His tuxedo was tailored to perfection, his smile a practiced weapon of charm. He spotted Lucasta immediately, offering her a brief, possessive nod before his eyes sought out Gustav. Gustav watched him approach, feeling the adrenaline flood his system. The trap was armed. The bait was set. It was time to close the jaws. A magnificent evening, Gustav, Catriel said, arriving with a fresh flute of champagne. He stopped beside Gustav, his gaze sweeping the room before settling on the engineer. A fitting celebration for the future of Aerospatiale. Indeed, Gustav replied, his voice a calm, even baritone that betrayed nothing. The future is always built on the foundation of the present, Catriel. One must be careful that the foundation is secure. Catriel's smile widened slightly, a flicker of genuine amusement playing across his features. An engineer's perspective, always concerned with structural integrity. But rest assured, Gustav, the foundation is entirely secure. I have personally overseen the necessary audits this morning. It was a veiled confirmation. Catriel had accessed the secure terminal. He had taken the corrupted CAD files, believing them to be the genuine blueprints, the ultimate leverage. He had swallowed the hook entirely. Lucasta approached them, her footsteps nearly silent on the polished stone floor. She stopped beside Gustav, her proximity a physical ache he had learned to ignore. The tension between the three of them was a palpable, vibrating frequency that the rest of the gala was blissfully unaware of. Catriel, Lucasta said, her voice tight, a fragile attempt at social normalcy. Have you reviewed the secondary testing schedules? I have, Lucasta, Catriel replied, turning his predatory charm upon her. In fact, I believe I have everything I need to ensure the Helios 9 project proceeds exactly as planned. Gustav saw the imperceptible shudder that ran through Lucasta's frame. He saw the terror in her eyes as she glanced at him, a silent plea for forgiveness she didn't know how to articulate. The knowledge that her initial betrayal was a desperate, misguided attempt to save him warred violently with the cold reality of her infidelity. But he had made his choice in the server room. The machine of his revenge was in motion, and it could not be stopped. I'm glad to hear it, Gustav said, his tone shifting imperceptibly, dropping the facade of the defeated engineer. He turned to Catriel, a sudden, chilling clarity in his eyes. Because the Directorate General for Internal Security is remarkably thorough when they investigate anomalies in data transmission. Catriel's smile faltered, a microscopic crack in his perfect composure. I beg your pardon. Enjoy the champagne, Catriel, Gustav said quietly, his gaze boring into the auditor's soul. It is likely the last you will have for a considerable amount of time. Before Catriel could formulate a response, Gustav turned his back on them both, walking away into the glittering crowd. He did not look back at Lucasta. He did not need to. The countdown had begun, and the silence that followed him was the sound of a world preparing to shatter. The Site de l'Espace Gala was at its zenith, a glittering tableau of clinking crystal and murmured ambitions beneath the towering replica rockets. The string quartet had transitioned into a lively waltz, yet for Gustav, the music was a distant, irrelevant hum. He stood near the exit, a solitary figure in black, his eyes fixed on the entrance. He checked his watch. It was 9:45 p.m. Across the room, Catriel was suddenly moving with a rigid, unnatural haste. The predatory grace was gone, replaced by a tense, vibrating anxiety. He was staring at his smartphone, his thumbs swiping frantically across the screen. Gustav watched the color drain from Catriel's face, a slow, satisfying confirmation that the digital guillotine had dropped. The custom security script had triggered perfectly. The moment Catriel had attempted to transfer the stolen CAD files from his secure terminal to an external, unmonitored cloud server, presumably to secure his leverage or sell it to a competitor, the system had locked him out. It had simultaneously blasted a high-priority alert to the Directorate General for Internal Security, DGSI, and the Aerospatiale Dynamics Executive Board, flagging his credentials for Class 1 industrial espionage. Gustav saw the exact moment Catriel realized he was trapped. The auditor looked up from his phone, his eyes scanning the crowd with the panicked intensity of a cornered animal. His gaze locked onto Gustav. The realization hit Catriel like a physical blow. The desperate, broken engineer he had blackmailed was a phantom. The entire surrender had been a meticulously engineered performance. Before Catriel could move toward him, the heavy oak doors of the gala hall swung open. 4 men in understated dark suits entered, their demeanor entirely incongruous with the festive atmosphere. They moved with a chilling, synchronized purpose, bypassing the champagne trays and the bewildered glances of the guests. They were DGSI agents. The waltz faltered, a discordant scrape of bows against strings as the cellist noticed the intrusion. A hush fell over the room, rippling outward from the entrance like a shockwave. Catriel froze. He looked from the approaching agents to Gustav, his mouth opening in a silent, desperate denial. He understood the files were corrupted. He understood the trap. But the arrogance that had fueled his extortion was suddenly replaced by sheer terror. He reached for his inner jacket pocket, perhaps for the real, initial flaw report, the gun Lacasta had given him, but an agent was already upon him. Monsieur Laurent, the lead agent said, his voice barely above a murmur, yet it carried across the sudden silence of the hall. He produced a leather wallet, flashing a silver badge. You are required to accompany us. Immediately. Catriel's facade shattered completely. This is a mistake, he stammered, his voice cracking, the polished auditor reduced to a panicked thief. He looked desperately toward the executive board members who were now staring at him in shock. I am quality assurance. I was conducting a sanctioned audit. The data transfer you initiated at 2140 was not sanctioned, monsieur, the agent replied coldly, his hand resting firmly on Catriel's elbow. It was flagged as a theft of proprietary military technology. Turn around, please. As Catriel was forcefully turned and led toward the exit, his eyes frantically searched the crowd one last time. They found Lacasta. She was standing near the champagne fountain, frozen, her face ashen. She watched the man she had betrayed her husband for, the man who had manipulated her desperation into a weapon, being escorted out like a common criminal. The illusion of their affair, the intoxicating escape he had promised, evaporated in the harsh light of reality. Gustav watched her absorb the destruction. He saw her chest heave with a silent, devastating sob. He had won. He had protected the Helios 9, neutralized the blackmail, and orchestrated the public ruin of his rival without leaving a single fingerprint. He was the architect of a flawless victory. But as he looked at the shattered woman in the midnight blue dress, the triumph tasted like ash. The machine was safe, but the home it was built for was entirely in ruins. The cold rain of Toulouse had intensified by the time Gustav stepped out of the Site de l'Espace, the heavy drops drumming against the concrete like applause for a tragedy concluded. The flashing blue lights of the DGSI vehicles were a fading smear in the distance, carrying Catriel away to a future of interrogations and iron bars. Gustav stood under the sweeping glass canopy of the entrance, the collar of his tuxedo dampening. He was waiting. He did not have to wait long. Lacasta emerged from the gala, her backless midnight blue gown offering no protection against the chill. She walked with the stiff, mechanical gait of someone who had just survived a car crash but hadn't yet realized they were bleeding out. She stopped a few paces from him, the ambient light catching the tears tracking silently down her pale cheeks. They stood in silence, the noise of the departing guests a muffled hum behind the thick glass doors. The air between them was saturated with 8 years of shared history, now irrevocably contaminated. "You knew," Lucasta whispered, her voice barely carrying over the rain. She didn't ask it as a question. It was a terrifying realization of the depth of his deception. "You knew everything." Gustav turned to face her, his expression a mask of chilling composure. He felt a phantom ache in his chest, a memory of the woman in Lion who used to map the stars with him, but he ruthlessly suppressed it. "I found the synchronization error on your laptop," he stated, his voice flat, devoid of the panic he had feigned so perfectly in his office. "The photos from the Grand Balcone, and the unredacted inspection report you gave him." Lucasta flinched as if struck. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering violently. "Gustav, she choked on the words, the magnitude of her betrayal suffocating her. "It wasn't what you think. Not at first." "I know what it was, Lucasta," he cut in, his tone sharp and unforgiving. He took a step closer, closing the distance between them, invading her space. "I read your draft emails. I saw the desperate pleas you never sent him. You gave him the report to delay the audit. You thought you were buying me time to fix the turbine. You thought you were saving me." She looked up at him, her eyes wide with shock. A fragile, desperate hope flared in her gaze. Hope that he understood. Hope that the genesis of her treason might mitigate the crime. She sobbed, the tears flowing freely now. "He promised me he would flag it as a minor anomaly. He promised me he wouldn't use it against you. I just wanted to protect you from the board, from yourself." "And then you slept with him," Gustav said quietly. The words were a precision strike, shattering her fragile hope instantly. "You handed him the gun to protect me, and then you climbed into bed with the executioner while he aimed it at my head." The brutality of the statement hung in the cold air. Lucasta sobbed openly, burying her face in her hands. "He was blackmailing me, Lucasta," Gustav continued, his voice rising slightly, the suppressed rage finally bleeding through his controlled facade. "He demanded the final CAD files. He was going to steal the Helios 9, void the patents, and have me arrested for criminal negligence. All with the ammunition you provided." "I didn't know," she cried, shaking her head frantically. "He lied to me. He used me. Gustav, I am so sorry." "You are a brilliant physicist, Lucasta," Gustav said, his voice dropping back to a cold, dead calm. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek, black USB drive, the encrypted backup of the real, uncorrupted blueprints. He held it up between them, a physical manifestation of his life's work. "You calculate variables. You understand cause and effect. Yet you failed to calculate that a man willing to extort an engineer might also be willing to manipulate his lonely wife." He dropped his hand, the USB disappearing back into his tuxedo. He looked at her, truly looked at her, perhaps for the last time. The woman he loved was gone, replaced by a tragic, broken variable in an equation he had finally solved. "I saved the engine," Gustav said softly, turning away from her, stepping out from under the canopy and into the freezing rain. "But you destroyed everything else." The rain that had washed over Toulouse the night of the gala had finally ceased, leaving behind a cold, anemic morning sunlight that struggled to penetrate the expansive windows of the suburban villa. The house was profoundly, unnervingly quiet. It lacked the subtle, familiar sounds of life, the hum of the espresso machine, the rustle of a silk blouse, the soft cadence of Lucasta's voice discussing thermodynamics. It had been 3 days since the DGSI agents had escorted Catriel Laurent from the site de l'espace. 3 days since the Aerospatiale Dynamics Board, reeling from the scandal of a foiled corporate espionage plot, had unanimously approved the delayed launch schedule for the Helios 9, granting Gustav the time he needed to implement his structural patch. The crisis was averted. The patents were secure. Catriel was facing a decade in a federal penitentiary. Gustav had won. He had executed the perfect countermeasure. He sat at the heavy mahogany desk in his study, the room immaculate and orderly, a stark contrast to the chaotic battlefield it had been weeks prior. The blue light of the laptop screen was gone, replaced by the stark, unforgiving white of a legal document resting on the polished wood. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Beside the papers sat a Mont-Blanc fountain pen, a gift from Lacasta on their 3rd anniversary, back when the apartment in Lyon was still a warm memory rather than a ghost story. The ink was a deep, authoritative blue. He stared at the thick stack of paper, his eyes tracing the dense legalese that systematically dismantled 8 years of shared history. The division of assets, the severance of mutual accounts, the cold, bureaucratic language that reduced a passionate intellectual partnership to a series of equitable distributions. Lacasta had not contested a single clause. She had packed her bags the morning after the gala, her face a pale, tear-streaked mask of profound regret, and walked out of the glass villa without a word. Gustav picked up the pen, the metal cool and heavy in his hand. He unscrewed the cap, his movements slow, deliberate. He was a man who spent his life calculating the structural integrity of machines, ensuring they could withstand the most extreme atmospheric pressures without fracturing. Yet, as he looked at the signature line, he felt a profound, internal collapse, a catastrophic failure of the heart that no algorithm could patch. He had built a digital labyrinth to snare a predator. He had watched the man who threatened his life's work led away in handcuffs. He had looked into his wife's eyes and delivered the fatal blow to their marriage with surgical precision. He had protected his engine. But sitting in the vast, echoing silence of his perfect home, he realized the devastating truth of his victory. The vengeance had not healed the wound of her betrayal. It had only cauterized it, leaving a numb, permanent scar. He had outsmarted them both, but he had lost the only person who truly understood the language of his mind. He leaned forward, pressing the nib of the pen against the paper. The ink flowed smoothly, tracing the familiar cursive of his name. A single, treacherous tear escaped his rigid control, falling silently onto the crisp white page, blurring the final loop of his signature. He stared at the smudged ink, the small, undeniable evidence of his brokenness. He placed the pen down, aligning it perfectly parallel to the edge of the document. He had his patents. He had his freedom. He had his pride. But the equation of his life was suddenly entirely hollow. The blueprints were flawless, Lacasta. Gustav whispered to the empty room, the sound swallowed immediately by the sterile silence. It was only the people that were broken.